I just want to say to our audience here that the reason our speakers have been so good about sticking to their time is that I've got a little electronic prod underneath them, you know, and I zap them with an electronic shock when they get over time. I just have to say that hearing Bob and Ogun speak, I can't imagine in 1988, those of you who were present in 1988 or 89 or, you know, something right around then, I can't imagine anybody standing up there and urging political leaders to make the kinds of changes that you folks have urged at this point, which shows, I think, a good deal of the progress that has been made. I guess, are we being hijacked or what? I'm going to ask you to, Yuri, I'm going to ask you to sit in your seat, please, if you would, please. I'm going to ask all of the panelists in a minute here to
speak very shortly in Russian.
I understand, but would you please take your seat?
But it's not,
There is a microphone. Don't worry about it. Please take your seat. I'm going to ask the panelists if there is something. I'm going to ask the panelists if there is something that was omitted from the reports that you've just heard that you feel is important to talk about at this point. Mr. Chin? Yeah, please give him the mic. Thanks. Okay, we'll all take our turn, you know.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Okay.
So I would like to make a thanks to Sir Jiang for his excellent presentation about the process of the progress of IPCC Working Group 1. And you know that during the 20 years, it's not too long history, but it's very important because IPCC built a very, very strong scientific basis for science and for policies. And this science and policy affect the application almost in all countries in the world. For example, in China, last year in the July, years 2007, the Chinese government built the China's National Climate Change Program. If you enjoy that, you can get this small book outside this room. And another sample is that China just finished the Olympic Games in Beijing. And the very important thing is the green science and the culture Olympic Games, which I think also affected strongly by the IPCC conclusions. And for the future, Sir Jiang, you make the conclusions that we must pay more attention for the assessment on regional scale. I think it's very, very important. We also must make more attention about the sea level change. How long, when, where? It's 1 year after or 100 years after? 100 years after. And as the developer, I'm from China, from development country. And I think for the future assessment of IPCC, I suggest that we must pay more attention to increase the members of the developing country so that can make the better of the assessment.
All right, thank you very much,
Thank you very much.
Chin. And I'm going to call on Yuri Israel now, who clearly indicates he wants to contribute. I'm going to ask you to speak in English. Of course, it's up to you to decide what you choose to do.
Спасибо. Нет, я все-таки несколько слов скажу по-русски. Если потом вы захотите, чтобы я по-английски для телевидения сказал, я вам скажу и по-английски. А сейчас я хочу сказать по-русски. Прежде всего, я хочу поздравить всех участников IPCC с блестящими достижениями, которые отмечены Нобелевской премией. Мне очень понравилось выступление Джона Хоутона. Надо сказать, что он сказал две важных вещи. Первое, то, что делалось в IPCC, делалось вначале в первой рабочей группе, а потом использовалось во второй и в третьей, чтобы получить результатов того, что прогнозируется. И мы во второй рабочей группе уже с самого начала сделали много важных выводов последствий гидрологических, лесных и других. И я думаю, что это очень важно. И второй важный вопрос, который он поднял, это вопрос о том, как добиться улучшения ситуации. Так вот, я хочу сказать, что вот очень важным результатом работы первой рабочей группы было обсуждение и публикация климатообразующих факторов, где на первом месте стояло и стоит парниковые газы. Но там имеется еще 7-8 важных факторов. И когда мы говорим о том, каким образом нам нужно решать проблему, безусловно, мы должны думать не только о парниковых газах. Конечно, борьба с парниковыми газами остается главным, но, тем не менее, использование остальных климатообразующих факторов, в качестве примера я скажу, 13 президентов академий, которые собрались в Токио и подготовили свое заявление для саммита, они указали о том, что нужно использовать в том числе технологии геоинжиниринга. То есть таким образом не только способы и методы борьбы с парниковыми газами, но и другие методы целесообразны. Поэтому я очень с большим интересом жду будущего развития работы IPCC. И в заключение скажу одну важную фразу. Я думаю, она всем подходит. Наши достижения IPCC очень велики, но впереди большая работа. Как говорят, оглядываясь назад, я снимаю шляпу, а глядя вперед, я засучиваю рукава. Благодарю вас.
Thank you very much, Mr. Israel. We appreciate the comment. Okay, I'm going to ask other panelists now. Forgive me, I've just met all of you for the first time today, so I'm not going to be able to recognize this. Osvaldo Canziani?
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to say something which has been missing for a number of years in developing areas, mainly, although it might be also applicable to developed areas. We are missing something which has been referred to as adaptation. Adaptation is an important issue. We have many things to do still in the IPCC and in many other areas of the environmental sciences. But one thing is, Article 5 of the Convention is quite clear on that. We need data. Niels Bohr mentioned in 1930, without information, without data, you don't do anything. You have to know what to do with the measurements. And this is failing. The GCOS, which is the Global Climate Observing System, is failing in all the developing regions. Implementations are below 35%. And we spent 7 years ago a number of months discussing the new GCOS. And finally, after the COP10 in 2004 in Buenos Aires, the GCOS group in the WMO had the possibility of presenting this, and now we have some funding. I saw here today John Silman from Australia, who has been involved in this matter. So we need to bring to the attention of developing countries the urgent need to know first what they have in climate, because many regions are completely empty, so no data is available. And discussing with glaciologists in Antarctica, the distance between different stations is so large that you cannot do very much without information. In addition to that, we need to compile information regarding the costs of the events now with the climate change issues, I mean storms, tornadoes, and so on, in a way to convince political decisors to take action to do adaptation. If they don't know the pricing of the things they will lose, they will very hard to be convinced to produce information, particularly in developing areas. And the other thing which the Secretary General of the WMO mentioned is the early alert. The United Nations has developed the ISDR, which is the International System of Disaster Relief, and we are working in this area with private or non-governmental organizations to try to train people not to go in the moment the risk is already affecting population, but managing the risk in the sense to provide information to take action prior to the disaster. And this is a very important thing which call again for data. Heavy precipitation is critical, and we don't have stations providing for that in developing areas. I'm sure something might happen also in developed areas. It has been shown recently with disasters, floodings and so on, with the Katrina and Wilma hurricanes. In any case, let me summarize. We need more data in developing countries. the technical paper on water is critical. Chapter 8 mentioned that we are facing decaying of observing systems, and I don't believe that models will resolve the problem. We need to have data for going on, and in addition to that, compile information, building up the biological, socioeconomic information to provide a better vision to the decision makers to take action. Thank you.
Mr. Canziani, I'm not sure I was able to hear everything you said, but you talked about the importance of events in driving political leaders to make decisions. That's pretty controversial in large parts of the world that are skeptical of the IPCC's work. It's a big political football in the United States to talk about hurricanes, floods, and storms as being a political driver for action on
capitalism.
Yes, this is true, but in developed countries, you don't suffer the effect that it happened with many of the hurricanes in the Caribbean area because you are prepared, you have a system. Even though the hydrological studies being made in New Orleans demonstrated years ago that New Orleans was the second city which would be affected by hurricane, and they missed that because it was not an alert system. So in developing areas, it's worse. If you don't have information, you cannot go anywhere. But if you don't tell to the politician how to do things, the cost of things, they will not do anything.
Is there another panelist who wants to insert something that may have been missed? Okay, Martin Parry.
Well, I guess the next 36 hours are going to perhaps tell a story about big events and the Gulf Coast and whether it needs big events to...
As well as the political impact.
Well, that's what I mean, to create the political impact. Let's hope it doesn't have a big story to tell us. I just wanted to comment on the uniqueness of this organization, which Berlin developed very carefully and which we've inherited, and how it, I think it is unique because I don't think there is any other parallel, and yet I don't really see how it can exist in its present form without a substantial need to change to meet the sheer urgency of the situation. The uniqueness is that essentially this is a matter of scholarship of the best scientists, and indeed I think the IPCC has been able to get the best scientists acting as scholars and concluding their best judgments. And yet, and this is where it's all finessed, a process whereby governments buy into this. That's what makes the big difference and why the IPCC assessments have made such a contribution. Well, how to maintain that when we have a greater urgency that flows from the recognition of the issue, when the IPCC itself has concluded that the issue is greater than we expected, the magnitude of the change and the rapidity with which it's occurring. How do we maintain this? I think we've been lucky to some extent, but also gifted, yes, others have, in performing successfully as what I would call, and I don't mean it disparagingly, as gifted amateurs, with very little support, relatively speaking. Do we need to make a transition from gifted amateur status to something much more professional? And if we did, does that threaten the uniqueness of the situation, capturing the scholarship of the best 1,000 or so scientists? I don't mean to be disparaging by using the word gifted amateur, but I mean we have a incredibly small resource base, a very small secretariat, small technical support units that exist for a few years and then are transferred to another country, with the risk of relatively little institutional memory. I don't have answers to that, but I think it is going to be a pressing question for those involved in the sixth assessment.
Okay, did I see Bert Metz, did you? Or no, I'm sorry. Jim, did you?
Yeah. Yes,
Jim Bruce.
Thinking of the fact that this is the 20th birthday of IPCC, I was thinking of the evolution of the work of the Working Group 3, which Ogun didn't have much time to cover since he was covering so much already. And I think that's rather instructive. The first assessment, we weren't quite sure what we wanted out of Working Group 3, and they were asked to report on possible responses or something as vague as that. The second time round, it was decided that we really had to look at the cross-cutting social and economic issues. And Ho Sung Lee and I, who chaired that effort, put a lot of effort into recruiting some of the best economists and social scientists in the world, including I think we had 2 Nobel prize-winning economists in the team. On the social sciences side, I can't help but think of the wonderful workshop that Richard Odingo organized in Kenya on equity issues associated with
capitalism,
in which it was very clear that the poorest people of the rich countries and the poorest people in the world were going to be most severely hurt by
capitalism.
But the economics work was, I think, quite remarkable in the second report and has gone even to greater heights in the third and fourth report, where much refinement has been made of the costs of action and, to some extent, the costs of inaction.
Let me follow up on that. As a TV journalist, I think probably you all know that I would have a propensity to try to ask a controversial question to see if we can generate any controversy here. So let me follow up on your point, which is, I'd like to hear a few of you at least talk about whether you think it's going to be more expensive to fix the problem or more expensive to adapt to the problem the way it is now. Because that's going to be a question that politicians certainly are going to be asking themselves as they have to face re-election or renomination, reappointment, or whatever over the coming decades when they have to confront these issues. You want to take the lead on that?
Let me make one comment. I think all of the third assessment, or all of the reports from Working Group 3, suggest that there is a significant amount of reduction of emissions that you can achieve at little or no cost, and that is the benefits of doing these things outweigh the cost. Then there's some more things you can do that cost something, but when you figure it out, it isn't a very large percentage of the gross domestic product of the countries of the world or of the world as a whole. In fact, one of these outstanding economists that we managed to recruit told me one time that the loss in GDP could be shown in the thickness of a pencil line drawn to show the increase of GDP of countries.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Okay, Martin.
One of the conclusions from the fourth assessment that was picked up and reinforced from the third was that really we need both adaptation and mitigation, and that to contrast the costs of adaptation, of doing nothing but picking up the damage costs later, as against upfront costs, in a sense is not a helpful comparison. On the one hand, we have climate change occurring now, and we're having to adapt to that now. And as Bob Watson said, we are committed to a further 0.7 degree, even if we were to chop emissions off at the knees now. So I'm not sure how the translator handled that point. Even if we were to reduce all emissions to current levels now. So that there's a lot of impacts we will have to adapt to or pay the damage costs for. And on the other side, well, I'll stop for the moment, except to say that as we let climate change continue, the more likely we are to exceed the capacity to adapt. So we need mitigation to avoid the thresholds of impacts, and we need adaptation to sort of trawl up those impacts that we can't avoid. I think we need both.
Okay. Bert, did you have your... No? Okay. I just want to... Okay, let me introduce Ho Sung Lee, whom I failed to introduce earlier because I guess you weren't in the room at the time, so I apologize for that. Ho Sung Lee of Korea, a specialist in energy and economies, who co-chaired the mitigation group with Mr. Bruce during the second assessment. Go ahead, please.
Right. Regarding your question of the cost of adaptation versus cost of mitigation, I think this is really about time to integrate this vulnerability aspect with the mitigation aspect. So we need time to have some aspect of total cost of avoiding certain certain amount of climate damage. Not so far, we only looked at the cost of mitigation. What we left out thus far, in large measure,
Capitalism.
benefit of avoiding those damages. So we need to integrate those two, and to do so, there must be some very close link between the works of Working Group 2 and Working Group 3.
With 13 very bright scientists on the stage, at any time here, you could have an enormous debate. We've come to the end of our time, but I'm going to ask the three chairs of the groups who made the initial presentations to offer a final word. If you try to keep it to about a minute, I'd appreciate that. And I'm going to throw a question out.
Capitalism.
Work this into your final comment. I'd certainly welcome that. You've been speaking about the cost to politicians in terms of reduction of GDP and the cost in economic terms. What about the political costs to elected officials who have to make tough decisions at a time when they have to face voters, as distinct from the more long-term costs of facing a GDP reduction or contributions from the economies of the three nations? Sir John, do you want to take the first closing word on whatever topic you choose, or answer that question?
Just one further point to emphasize. I think that anybody's really emphasized this, that the IPCC has tended to be conservative in its reports. We've never overplayed what we know, what we think we know, because we wanted to be cautious, and we believed that people would listen to us much more readily if they believed that we were being absolutely honest and we're not hyping it up in any way. We were aware of some of the positive feedbacks right from the start, and we mentioned them. We didn't realize how very positive some of them are turning out to be. And these are not being balanced by negative feedbacks entirely. The positive feedbacks are much stronger. So the message is getting stronger as it goes through the whole time. And just to point on what Professor Israel was saying earlier on, there are some people who say, well, you talk about greenhouse gases, let's look at all the other things. We have looked at all the other things. We've looked at all of the IPCC reports are full of the factors that make
Capitalism.
in whatever way. The whole thing is put in a balanced way in the IPCC reports. So that's a bit of nonsense which is being propagated by those who want to propagate nonsense.
Ogun Davidson, let me ask you to insert a final word here, if you like. Yes, please. Sorry.
Thank you. I think if I should do it very simply, first, what is the message to the politicians? I think the politicians are faced with a very important problem to cope with climate extremes, whether we call it climate change or not. And by solving those extremes, you will be helping the climate change disasters. And it is far cheaper to do what we are saying in our reports than trying to avoid those climate extremes because they are coming. And the second point I just want to mention, especially to politicians, is far cheaper to save energy, get a more secured energy system, and at the same time, trying to stabilize the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So please, politicians, listen to what we are saying. You can help to make your life better by saving on the greenhouse gases that we put in the atmosphere.
Can you assure them that they'll help to get reelected or extend their terms in the process of doing this?
That's the best way they can stay in power.
Okay. And Bob Watson, if I may ask you for the final word.
It's clear we need to both mitigate and adapt to
Capitalism.
If you care about future generations, as Nick Stern did, so he had a low discount rate in his calculation, it's much cheaper to mitigate than to adapt. There are physical, behavioral and institutional and technological limitations to adaptation, so the best adaptation strategy is to mitigate. And everyone works for self-interest, individuals, governments, communities, and the self-interest is to look after our children and our grandchildren. And therefore, we need to take a long-term perspective, both within government, in the private sector, and each within our daily lives. However, we are not being serious. There is one technology that's absolutely critical, and that's carbon capture and storage. Because most technology most electricity will still be produced from coal in 50 years' time. We absolutely have to invest in future energy technologies, and we're playing around, we're not being serious, and we need to invest in carbon capture and storage and a few other pre-commercial technologies.
You know, I'd love to continue the debate. It's a wonderful discussion, and I'd love to continue it, but we have a lot of other moving parts in this discussion and this event. I do want to highlight something Mr. Chin said earlier, which is for all of you in the audience here. If you want to know more about any of the topics our panelists have mentioned today or about the work of the IPCC, there are posters, videos, there are materials in the lobby outside here tonight. Take advantage of this opportunity today to pick up what you need to know, what you want to know, and what you want to disseminate to your own interest groups. So we've spent the past, hour and a half or so celebrating the achievements of the first 2 decades of the IPCC's experience. A bit later in our program, the current chair of the IPCC, Dr. Pachauri, will lead us on an adventure into the science and politics of the future of capitalism issues, which should be interesting. But right now, I'm going to ask our panelists on the stage here to leave the stage as we all offer them our appreciation for their hard work and significant achievements.
Thank you very much, Yuri. Let's walk off together.
How are you feeling?